right, so welcome to Robert Sutherland Hall. My name is Willow Hillman, and I'm an MPA student here, and this is Policy School of Policy Studies. I've also been a student of in the Department of Political Studies just across the courtyard there. And before we begin, I hope that you will join me in taking a moment to acknowledge that Queen's University is situated on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Kim Nossal. He's the man to speak to when it comes to Canadian foreign policy. I'm sure there's very little argument with that. Today he'll be discussing a topic which I have recently become very interested in myself, and that's Canadian defense policy, and particularly its politicization. Aside from a rather lengthy list of publications and an illustrious teaching career, Professor Nossal is the director of the Center for International and Defense Policy here, and a former director and chair of the School of Policy Studies, also a former editor for the International Journal. His research interests include both Canadian and Australian foreign and defense policy, international stabilization, and Canada-US relations. Professor Nossal has inspired many students, including myself, way back in Paul's 110, to pursue the fascinating questions which surround politics and international relations. He's a very compelling scholar and individual, and I'm sure that the next hour will be very, very interesting. Throughout Professor Nossal's presentation, please consider using the Slido program to ask and vote on questions for the professor to answer.
Hey, how you doing?
The hashtag you'll need to use is hashtag MPA19. Also, people watching via live stream can also participate. We'll also be taking a few questions from the crowd. And without further ado, thank you, and please join me in welcoming Professor Nossal.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Willow, and thank you for surviving the winter term of 2013. It is a great pleasure to be back at the school. Even though I'm just a couple of flights up, it's always a great pleasure to participate in the activities of the School of Policy Studies. Today, as the slide indicated, what I would like to do is to think about something that lies at the core, it seems to me, of professional civil servants, of bureaucrats. And I know that in welcoming the PMPA class, there'll be folks who are in harness, as it were, and know about this in their daily lives. For the MPA, looking forward to working within the state as a civil servant. This will be, I think, one of the core elements that is going to be important. Going well beyond the sort of the ordinary dictionary definition of the idea that there are certain things that can be made political, and that's politicization. Instead, what I want to do is to focus on how scholars think about the issue of politicization and the civil servant and the bureaucrat. All of you will be, of course, familiar with the old and rather hoary at this point dichotomy between the bureaucrat and the elected representative and the elected leader. And that politics administration dichotomy is, of course, there as the ideal, however mythological it is. What we've seen in response to the original laying out of that dichotomy in the latter part of the 19th and early 20th century, the notion that rather than the mythological apolitical bureaucrat, we have bureaucrats, civil servants, who have a deeply political role, but their role can be arrayed on a spectrum of sort of neutral competence, the way that Rockman and Aberbach have outlined it, the responsive competence, or as Thurid Hustet and Heidi Solomonson have looked at the notion of competent neutrality, the idea that bureaucrats, civil servants, are not entirely political, but instead have a neutrality that is driven by their expertise, the provision of advice to the political leadership on the basis of expert knowledge. In the literature, much of the focus of politicization focuses on the question of appointments and the politicization of the appointment process of civil servants. A secondary focus is on the activities of bureaucrats and how the activities of what civil servants do on a day-to-day basis can be driven by making or rendering them political. A third focus is on the civil service advice by politicians and ministerial staff. In other words, the degree to which the advice, the frank and fearless advice rendered by civil service, by civil servants, by bureaucrats, can be taken and twisted and spun by politicians and by politicians' staff. And indeed, Hustet and Solomonson have presented those three foci in their particular typology, which they render as formal or functional or administrative. What I want to do this afternoon is look at another kind of politicization that we don't really see up here. And that is the attempt by political leaders and by political parties to use policy issues that need expertise and competence, but to use them for electoral advantage. And when one thinks about this way of thinking about politicization, we have to recognize that there are two particular kinds of politicization, two variants. One is what, when I think about it as routine, for reasons that I'll get to in a moment. And then there's another kind of politicization, a notion of which I'm not entirely comfortable with the use of this particular prefix, but we'll get to that in a moment. Routine politicization is the use of policy issues for electoral purposes, openly electoral purposes, but this is seen as fundamentally normal and acceptable by both the political side and the civil service side. And the nicest example of this is the case of offsets in defense procurement. The idea that if a procurement costs $2 billion, that expenditure of $2 billion on a piece of capital equipment is offset by the expenditure, usually by the contractor within the purchasing government's economy, of an equivalent amount or more. If you think about offsets as a tool, a policy tool, you can see that certainly in the Canadian case and in the case of many other governments and their defense procurement policies, we can see an essential normal nature of this. It's accepted and understood that in Canada, defense procurement decisions, especially in times of systemic peace, are driven largely for non-defense reasons. Instead, they're driven for reasons of regional economic policy, industrial development, technological enhancement. In other words, you buy something, a plane or a tank or a warship, and the purpose isn't so much to provide you with the capacity to use those bits of kit for what they're intended for. Rather, the purpose is to create other effects within the economy. And here, there is a clear electoral connection. Defense procurement, when it comes to the creation and implementation of offsets, is all about electoral politics, about party standings in particular places. What's routine about this is that, very simply, it's not political in that sense. It is so taken for granted by all the players in the system that you can have a position against offsets and essentially say, no, defense procurement should only be for defense reasons, not for other reasons. But the element here is so deeply embedded, it's so taken for granted that it becomes routine. I want to talk about another kind of politicization, and that is what I think of as hyperpoliticization in the prefix sense of going way beyond a line. And I want to talk about a form of politicization where the political party uses a policy issue for nothing other than electoral advantage, for no other reason than electoral purposes. Using a policy issue to attack, delegitimize, to undermine other political parties in order for one purpose only, and that is to maximize votes. And there are certain dynamics associated with this kind of politicization. First and most importantly, although hyperpoliticization requires the use of a policy issue, it has nothing to do with policy. And the policy implications of playing games with a policy issue are simply ignored. In that sense, it's absolutely an opportunistic rather than a principled position. Routinely, when you play politics with a particular policy issue, you're going to have to ignore the evidentiary basis of policy, and basically you embrace irrelevant evidence in order to sustain your position. And when you are confronted with the competence, in particular the competence of those who know whereof they speak, you simply attack those inconvenient facts. Now, what I want to do today is to look at the case, a really good case of hyperpoliticization, and that is the case of Canada's replacement process for our jet fighters, for the replacement of that fleet of 138 what is classified as the CF-188. It's the CF-18 Hornet that was purchased in 1980, came into service by 1982. Originally 138, there are now somewhere like about 76 or so remaining. The F-18 wasn't meant to have lasted as long as it did. The process of replacing the CF-18 began actually in the late 1990s when the Canadian government, the Liberal government of Jean Chrétien, signed onto the CF-18 F-35 project, the multinational project headed by the United States, involving 9 other countries, essentially headed by the US, because what the US was planning to do in the 1990s was to have this plane as its only jet fighter in the 21st century. And a number of allies, a number of American allies, joined as partners in this project, either level 1 partners or level 2, or for the smaller countries like Canada, level 3. And this multinational project got underway in the late 1990s. Canada was on board. And essentially the process of developing the F-35 began to accelerate in the early part of this century. When the Conservative government came to power in 2006, Canada was still part of this process, and the Conservative government essentially began to actually move on, replacing the Hornet, the F-18, CF-18 Hornet fleet. In 2008, its defense policy statement, the Harper government promised that it would purchase a fleet of 65 next-generation fighters, and since the F-35 was the only 5th-generation fighter in existence that was able to be sold by the United States. There was another fighter, the F-22, which the Americans wouldn't allow even their allies to buy. So the statement in the 2008 policy could only have been referring to one thing, the F-35. At this point, the Harper government made a huge political error and a huge policy error. Instead of running an open competition for the jet fighter replacement fleet, what the government did was try to cut corners. And it did so by basically saying that since the F-35 was the only 5th-generation fighter on the market, and because Canada needed F-35s for the future of the Royal Canadian Air Force, there was no need for an open competition, because the F-35, if you needed a 5th-generation fighter, the F-35 would take it away. And so what the government decided to do was to sole source the replacement. And in July of 2010, they announced that there would be a purchase of 65, because that's all Canada needed, 65 fighters. And it would be on a sole source basis. And Lockheed Martin trucked up a model of an F-35 from Texas. And on July Friday afternoon, always the best time, the very best time to make big announcements, the Minister of National Defense, Peter MacKay, made the announcement, was photographed, and after this he climbed into the cockpit and gave big thumbs up. And what was important here was that when Mr. MacKay made the announcement, the price tag for these 65 planes was announced at $9 billion. And that was another mistake. That figure was a highly politicized figure. It was designed essentially to be as palatable as you could possibly make it, essentially because the F-35 had a reputation, well-deserved as it turns out, for being a very expensive plane, and so that when the Harper government announced that it was purchasing 65 of these, $9 billion sounds pretty good. Well, the moment that the government hitched star to the $9 billion figure, everything began to fall apart. Since the government had insisted on politicizing the acquisition by going sole source rather than simply going through the regular process, the Liberal opposition decided to return the favor and to politicize the acquisition. And what we see here is essentially a 2-year period of a kind of fun with numbers attacks on the F-35, because no sooner had the government made its announcement than the Liberal opposition was all over it on, well, wait a minute, the $9 billion is merely the flyaway cost, as it's called in defense procurement, rather than the real cost of this program. What's the real cost of the program? Well, it soon turns out that the real cost of the program is actually about $16 billion more expensive than $9 billion. It's around $25 billion. And that is because of, as you all know, when you're dealing with major capital projects, you've got to do the full life cycle costs, which, as you also know, especially for those of you who have been engaged in this, is itself a fun with numbers exercise. I mean, simply think of buying a car and trying to establish over, let's say, the 8 years that you intend to own the car, of all of the costs, every single cost associated with operating that car, all the way from the costs of learning to drive, the costs of registration, the cost of every liter of fuel that you will use, the insurance, the registration, the repairs, the spare parts, etc., all the way to the $300 you got to pay to the wrecker at the end of the car's life. Instead of what the way in which we usually buy cars, which is to think about the drive-away price. Well, the flyaway price of $9 billion was immediately attacked, and so very quickly it comes out that this is actually $25 billion. So what the Liberals then did was to sick the parliamentary budget officer on this program, and Kevin Page, the parliamentary budget officer, took a look at the F-35, and he looks at the cost and he says, no, this is not $25 billion. When I do my sums, and when the PBO did its work, no, this is $29 billion. Well, the Auditor General was next up. And Mr. Ferguson took a look at the program, and the Auditor General found two sets of things. The first was that the process by which the F-35 was purchased sole source was rife with oddities and corners cut and documents not produced in the right order. Essentially, what and the 2012 Auditor General's report remains, I would suggest, sort of mandatory reading for any bureaucrat or would-be bureaucrat, because it so nicely picks apart how bureaucrats, when they are left to their own devices, can indeed behave in particular ways that are the subject of Auditor Generals coming back. And so that there was a certain amount of delegitimization of the process because of the way in which the Department of National Defense, the Royal Canadian Air Force, the procurement folks, not so much the Industry Canada, but basically Procurement and D&D had basically fiddled the process. And again, if you read Mr. Ferguson's report, one can just see so much evidence of this. But Mr. Ferguson also found that there was a problem with the numbers. $29 billion? No. When he ran the numbers, what he found in April of 2012 was that the real cost of this program was going to be $36 billion. And at that point, the Harper government, so embarrassed by its incapacity to run a good procurement process, simply called a halt and first of all imposed a new governance arrangement on the process. Interestingly enough, although the Harper government had decided to engage in this massive expenditure without looking back and seeing, well, how did we do it the last time in the late 1970s? How did the Liberals of Pierre Trudeau do it? Because the last time, the F-18 acquisition between 77 and 80 has been usually held up as sort of the best acquisition program ever run for defense in Canada. Well, the Conservatives came to power thinking, bluntly put, that no one had anything to teach them about governing, certainly not Pierre Trudeau Liberals. And yet, in April of 2012, what they did was they looked back at what the Trudeau government had done, and they transferred that governing process at the bureaucratic level to the future fighter capability, as it was then quickly euphemistically called. One of the other things that Mr. Harper did was to ask KPMG to run its own exploration, its own examination of the fighter replacement and the F-35 sole source buy. And KPMG came in, and they said, 29 billion? No. 36 billion? No. No. $45.8 billion. This was in December of 2012. So quite literally, in 2 years and a couple of months, the price that Canadians were sort of hearing had gone from $9 billion to $45 billion. And at that point, the Harper government simply pulled the plug. Now, the Harper government never, in part because there were so few people who actually understood defense policy in that government or understood procurement, because there's a very simple reason why prices went from 9 billion to 45 billion. And it had everything to do with the assumption that you use about what the life cycle of this major capital equipment is going to be. In 2010, in addition to the flyaway costs, you had that extra $16 billion, so 25 billion. The 25 billion was based on the standard life cycle used by the Department of National Defense of 20 years. The life cycle used by both the Parliamentary Budget Officer and the Auditor General basically said, 20 years? No. Take a look at how long you've kept the F-18, the CF-18. No. 30 years, said Page. 36 years, said the Auditor General. And KPMG said, hey, by the time you get rid of the CF-18s, it's going to be at least 40 to 45 years. So they used a 42-year life cycle. Now, the fact is that what the Harper government could have done but didn't was essentially say, look, everyone, chill. Yes, we told you a rather large porky back in July of 2010. It's not really just $9 billion. We really should have said it was $25 billion. But whether or not you use a 20-year life cycle or a 42-year life cycle, the government could have said, it's going to cost you $1 billion a year as Canadians. That's what the F-35 is going to cost. But they didn't, and they simply suspended the program, reset it, and that was essentially the end of the sole source buy. Now, fast forward to 2015. Because what the Liberal Party, then in third place, decided to do was to essentially pull a Chrétien. And for those of you with really long memories, you will remember what Mr. Chrétien did in his effort to become Prime Minister in 1993, and that is he took another defense procurement package, a contract for Canada's search and rescue and maritime helicopters, the EH-101, and he promised that if he became Prime Minister, he would cancel this contract. And he did it for no other reason, truly no other reason, than to advance Liberal fortunes in the 1993 election. But on the very first day of office, 4th of November 1993, one of the very first things that the new Chrétien cabinet did was indeed to cancel the EH-101 contract. And basically, simply in the stroke of a pen, flushed $478 million down the toilet. And then, as for those of you who know the rest of this sad story, spent the next decade basically trying to deal with the fact that you still had old Sea Kings that you were flying. Mr. Trudeau took this line and applied it to the F-35. And one of the things that he promised to do was that, first of all, he promised that a Liberal government would not purchase the F-35. Secondly, a Liberal government would run an open and fair competition for a new fighter, in which, he said, Lockheed Martin and the F-35 would not be allowed to participate. Well, once Mr. Trudeau became Prime Minister, at the very first cabinet meeting, also on the 4th of November, this time in 2015, government lawyers took about 45 seconds to disabuse him and his cabinet colleagues of the idea that you could run an open and fair competition and exclude one of the prime contributors. However, having dug a hole that basically said we're not going to buy F-35s, the new government essentially had to find a way to make good its promise. And it did. It did by finding a wee fix, an imaginative fix, an effective fix, a deeply manipulative fix. And the way it worked was very simple. The Defense Minister took a look at Canada's fleet. At that point, it was 77 because subsequently one crashed. And he said, this isn't enough. We don't, if we're called on by our NATO allies and by the United States to do all of the things that we need to do with our jet fighters, 76 is just simply not enough. We need 88. We need 88 planes to fulfill all these missions just in case there's a major war and we need to fill all those missions at the same time. Because if you think about it, the number of planes, for example, that you need to fly a six-pack on a NATO mission is 6. To defend North America and the two regions of North America that Canada is responsible for, Canada East and Canada West, generally speaking, there are 2 CF-18s ready to be scrambled in each of those in each of those regions. Now, Mr. Sajan's urgent capability gap came as considerable news to the Royal Canadian Air Force, but there was very little in the way of pushback. So, as a consequence, because it was so urgent, the government needed to move immediately. And that meant buying sort of the next best thing to an F-35, and that is a Super Hornet. Despite the similarity in name, a Super Hornet made by Boeing is nothing like a legacy Hornet. A Super Hornet is, generally speaking, thought of as a sort of a 4.5 generation fighter. And therein was the fix, because as soon as you buy 18 Super Hornets, and you still have to replace your old legacy Hornets, when the time comes to replace them, what are you going to buy? Are you going to have like a fleet of 3 different aircraft? Are you going to have 18 Super Hornets and buy F-35s? Well, all you have to do is to look at Australia to see that the huge costs of running a 2-aircraft fleet, because they also bought Super Hornets and F-35s. No, the point here is if you've bought 18, then just keep those Super Hornets coming, and eventually that's what your fleet will be. It was a neat fix. It was based entirely on a fabricated construction of an urgent capability gap that simply does not exist. Now, I know that if General John Vance, the Chief of Defense Staff, was here, he would be jumping on me the way that General Vance tends to jump on critics, because he would basically make the argument that there absolutely is an urgent capability gap. My question is, if that's the case, why did the RCAF and the Department of National Defense fix 65 as our fighter fleet a decade ago? Number one. Number two, exactly why do you need 88 planes? And number three, are you really going to say that stuff is going to break out all over at the same time, requiring every single Canadian plane in use? But as you know, this nicely manipulative fix fell apart. In April of 2017, Boeing, in its infinite wisdom, filed a petition against Bombardier, claiming that Bombardier was subsidizing the CS-100 jets that it had just sold in large number to Delta. The United States agreed. Various component bits of the U.S., the Department of Commerce, the U.S. International Trade Commission agreed that the U.S. indeed could be harmed, and as a consequence, penalties were levied against Bombardier. 220% countervailing duty, an 80% penalty. In other words, those CS-100 jets just became 300% more expensive. Well, the result was that, as you know, the results for Bombardier were dramatic. The results for the Canadian aerospace industry were dramatic. The results for Airbus in Europe were fabulous. But Mr. Trudeau, needless to say, was not much amused. And promised that anyone who would attack Canadian workers, attack the aerospace industry, attack the economic base in Montreal, attack a firm that had been such a good friend to the Liberal Party of Canada, would have no business in Canada. And so now, all of a sudden, that Super Hornet fix is set aside. And the government has to essentially find another fix. And so it put another fix in. In December of 2017, the Super Hornet buy was cancelled, no particular surprise there. But the government still needs 18 planes if, in fact, it's going to maintain the lie about its capability gap. And that's where we get the 18 planes from Australia. Because the RAAF is receiving deliveries of its F-35 buy, because Canada and Australia basically bought F-35s at around the same time. And so now it's got an increasing number of old legacy F-18s that it had bought at the same time that Canada had bought Hornets in the early 1980s. And so Canada ended up buying 18 sort of clapped out old legacy Hornets that they're going to put into they're going to Canadianize and put into the Canadian fleet. And that's where we are today, and it remains a nice case of hyperpoliticization. And it has huge costs. I mean, quite apart from the policy implications, there's this hyperpoliticization in this particular case, a huge waste. There's a huge delay because every year that you delay, the costs grow. There is, of course, the impact on operational capability. If Canada continues to fly, sort of F-18s designed in the 1970s, built in the early 1980s, into the late 20s and early 30s, that's going to have an impact on operational capabilities. And they'll even have other smaller effects. The Auditor General, when he looked at the Australian F-18 buy, one of the things that his office was told was that the RCAF is facing a real recruitment problem because young folks are not really interested in being fighter pilots in a plane that is this old. But here is the essential question that I want to try and deal with by way of conclusion in the next couple of minutes. Here is a nice case of where a policy issue is being used for no other reason than to advantage the political party using it. And once in power, then sort of doubling down. And how, in fact, should civil servants deal with this? Should there be the question in the literature about how responsive should civil servants be to the wishes and desires of their political masters? Should they, as Husted and Salomonson suggest, there should be a sort of a neutrality, but it's got to be a neutrality based on competence to ensure that the elected representatives don't step over the line. There's another possibility, and that is what Rosemary O'Leary, the head of the School of Policy and Administration at the University of Kansas, has called guerrilla government. And what she really means here is when civil servants, when supposedly apolitical neutral bureaucrats are pushed into behaving as guerrillas do. And that is one of the possibilities. It's one of the possibilities that is exceedingly fraught. And the case of the motor vessel Asterisk is a nice example. This is another case of defense procurement disaster in Canada, where the government basically delays the replacement of two very old and decrepit auxiliary vessels to supply ships. And all of a sudden, one of them didn't make it through their expected life, and so Canada had to begin renting auxiliary supply vessels from Chile and Spain. And so Davie Shipyard in Lévis, Quebec, approached the Harper government and said, look, and they offered the Harper government a sort of basically a kind of public-private partnership where they would take a container vessel, they'd transform it into a naval supply ship. And the Harper government basically saw also the electoral possibilities of giving some work to a Quebec shipyard and said yes. And we are going to see the full nature of the story come out because the Trudeau government has pushed ahead with its trial, although it'll be interesting to see whether there are second thoughts. But when the Trudeau government was elected, Irving Shipyards in Halifax began to press against the Davie contract for the obvious reason of having it cancelled, and the work moved to Halifax. And it would very much appear that the number two in the Department of National Defense, Admiral Mark Norman, moved to make the request to the Trudeau government that this particular contract be cancelled, to make that public in a way that finally the Trudeau government found so embarrassing that it let the contract go. And the asterisk actually is, I mean, in a paradoxical way, it's the result of bad procurement decisions in the past, but it actually is a success in the sense that it got delivered to the Canadian Armed Forces on time and under budget, and now allows the rest of the rusting out fleet to actually go beyond Canada's shores without having to rent stuff from the Chileans or the Spaniards. If in fact the government's case, in the case of Admiral Norman, is correct, and we'll have to see it play out in court, then this might well be an example of Professor O'Leary's guerrilla government in action. And it poses that question of what is the appropriate response. But even if you basically say this is not the way to go, even though it might result in something good out of a bad hyper-politicized policy process, it nonetheless leaves open the question of how actually do you deal with such a case of hyper-politicization. And that's something that all of you will have to, for those of you who get employed by the state, will have to confront, or for those of you who are here on PMPA will no doubt have to confront in your lives today. That's it.
Okay, so now, hello, can you hear me? Excellent. Okay, so we're going to begin here with some question and answer, and we're going to begin with the crowd. So if anyone wants to start us off here while we're just transitioning over to Slido, does anyone have a question?
Yeah, just one question. I guess the good example of defense procurement was the national shipbuilding procurement, I think in 2011. I know
2010, yeah.
Yeah, I understood that as being primarily some public servant kind of driven process and kind of politicized. I wanted to talk about that a little bit as well.
Yeah, the national shipbuilding strategy, when it was put into place, was indeed widely regarded as the way to think about defense procurement, because the Harper government had actually taken considerable steps to ensure that its decisions on shipbuilding and how to allocate the process of replacing Canada's federal fleet, in other words, the Navy, the Coast Guard, the ferries, and the scientific parts of the fleet. And what the government did was to accept the recommendations of a world-class process that essentially said, here's the division between Irving in the East Coast, Seaspan on the West Coast. And there were some smaller shipyards that were losers. Davie, in 2010, was in bankruptcy. And so it wasn't part of the process. The problem with the national shipbuilding strategy is essentially that neither of the shipyards had the capacity to replace the federal fleet at the rate that it was rusting out. And so that, between 2010 and 2018, not a single vessel has been launched. Now, we've got vessels in the final stages, but the fact is, on the West Coast, they're far from actually producing what needs to be produced in terms of the fleet. Canada's replacement of the surface combatant fleet is years away. So, and now what we've got is the additional problem of Davie having been bought by a European firm, a reinvestment to make Davie actually a going concern. But just keep your ears up for the efforts of Irving in particular, but with a little assist from Seaspan, to basically try and ensure that Davie doesn't get any future, any serious future work. And certainly the original division in 2010 between Seaspan and Irving, there's no willingness at all to now make that a kind of tripartite thing.
All right, so moving now up to the Slido screen here. First question here is, does defense procurement for economic benefits as opposed to military ones cause a reduced quality of that which is procured?
I wouldn't frame it as the issue of quality, as much as it is the issue of quantity for the price. Because in essence, the moment that you begin to make defense decisions for non-defense reasons, what you end up with is a considerable impact on the overall price. Because the moment that you basically say, this product, we're going to buy it, but it's got to be made in Canada, or it's got to be assembled in Canada. Well, the moment that you do that, you basically, and unless you do other things that really put your foot down, what's going to happen is that the service concerned, the armed service concerned, is going to want to Canadianize. And the difficulty with that is that every time you add a tiny little component bit or change it to fit Canadian requirements, what you're going to find is that the cost, the unit cost, basically goes up. So it's not so much a matter of quality as a matter of how efficient is this. And you'll simply look at what happens when Canada is at war and needs a bit of kit and basically doesn't go through the process of procurement, but purchases off the shelf. There's very little problem. Think of our 777 howitzers that were purchased during our mission in Afghanistan. Bought right off the shelf, no Canadianization, no nothing. One of the things, interestingly enough, just as a kind of side note on this, that made the purchase of the CF-18 in the late 1970s such a success was because the government of Pierre Trudeau insisted that the F-18 purchased from the US was to have absolutely not a single modification done to it. And that's what happened. We basically bought the naval version, and so the planes we got had an aircraft carrier hook tucked on the back of them. The only modification that was allowed was the little bit of equipment on the nose wheel that allows an plane on an aircraft carrier to be moved around. Canada was allowed to take that off. But otherwise, it was done precisely because if you didn't, the Air Force would say, well, we really need this and this and this and this and this. Take a look at the Cyclone, the replacement for the Sea King. One of the reasons why we're not going to get Cyclones completely in the fleet until 2021 is because the Air Force and the Navy were allowed to introduce all sorts of modifications.
All right, so it seems that we have time for probably one more question here. The top one here is, does what's happening in the Trump administration, the so-called deep state officials, appointees working against Trump, etc., fit into the Guerra government?
Let's pass on that. It's a good question, but it involves like a quantum leap into a rather different discussion.
All right, the next, does the cost to cancel the sale of the labs to Saudi Arabia outweigh the humanitarian crisis it is causing in Yemen?
Well, first of all, we don't know what the actual costs of canceling it are. And the real costs have to do with the costs to employment in the London, Ontario area. I mean, essentially what the Canadian government could, if it wished, do is essentially take over the costs of basically just purchase all of those labs that are heading to Saudi Arabia. And you can do a whole bunch of things with a huge fleet of labs. And you could be imaginative about that. And that would be one way to preserve employment in London, while at the same time depriving the Saudis of even that little bit of kit provided by Canada. It would be costly, but we're an exceedingly rich country, despite the fact that Canadians love to moan about how poor we are. The fact is that we do have that capacity. So now I've created more time for a last question.
So very, very quickly then.
Oh, there's no one in here? All right.
Why not? Just in the back there, please.
I was looking at your sort of range of politicization, and I think it's fair to say that sometimes it's really hard to see how something that's purportedly for real-world electoral advantage is really for electoral advantage. It's more like deep partisan infighting, cross-partisan infighting. I mean, that's one of the things. But I'd also like to throw out, where is the role of corporate lobbying here? I mean, you don't label it as such, but that's like a huge variable. And it's not even economic development in the sense that it benefits people, voters. So just wondering about that.
Look, much of the defense procurement process is driven by companies that also have particular parochial interests that don't always align with the electoral concerns of political leaders or with the way in which bureaucrats who are charged with thinking about the national interest in those terms conceptualize them. And so it's not a matter of saying that they're not important. Absolutely they are important. Take a look at how Irving was incredibly important in trying to derail the Project Resolve, the Davy contract. But the real question is that focuses on not so much the relationship between elected leaders in cabinet or in parliament and the defense industry, as much as it is between the elected leaders and those in the civil service, who also have to have particularly close relations with the corporate community, with the defense industrial sector. I don't know whether that really answers your question.
No, I'm not saying you acknowledge it, but I just think it's a really strong variable, and it's distinct from the other forms of politicization. And I know you know that, but I just wanted you to.
Yeah, and I must admit, this presentation is very much more focused on this one particular case where it just is so clear that the government, the party first, and then the government in power, is just driven, and even to the exclusion. I mean, you know, we've got to probably wait for 50 years to see whether or not my assertion that what we've got here is essentially a manipulation on the part of the Minister of National Defense can in fact be sustained. I agree, it's an easy charge to lay. But the reality is, when you take a look at the situation on the ground, and in particular, when you look at the response of the head of the Royal Canadian Air Force, I don't think that there's any other conclusion. So this is I agree, a very particular case, and we don't see terribly many times that this happens. But boy, when it happens, it really poses, it seems to me, a really normative challenge for those who work for the state, who take professional pride in their apolitical neutrality. And this really challenges it.
So unfortunately, that is going to have to be our last question for today. Just like to thank Professor Nossal very, very much for that very interesting talk today.